I guess I'm going to introduce our next speakers. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and welcome to Space Populars Talk. This is their space, actually, as well, which we'll be talking about. Um, this is Lara and Fredrik. They work together. They are they're amazing architects, designers, and they're working in both digital and physical spaces. So I've known them for a bit. They've been on my radar beforehand because they've made these incredible spaces that like the one that you see here, which I was eyeballing for a while. And then when I got to meet them, I was really fascinated by their work because they do this lovely research in between, what digital spaces there are. You can also notice that the aesthetics of how they play with that in terms of space is it's not a recreation of reality. They're trying to play with some digital aesthetics and putting that in a space that makes it social. And the other thing that I think is really interesting, and something we were just talking about as well, is in particular that they're really incredible designers looking into creating spaces that are really social and inherently have like a public atmosphere to it. And that public part could be physical, because they do make physical installations and pieces that actually do have this kind of social engagement, whether that means engaging in the space or working together on something, but also in the digital realm. And this kind of idea of the third place online is a really fascinating aspect, given now, as we all know, the metaverse and questions that are arising, of course, because of that. And all of us here as well being all avatars from hopefully around the world. I'm actually curious in the chat. You guys can write where you actually are. I'm really curious to know. But they're here today to talk about their work, their research, some of their latest projects that are dealing with this bridge between the physical and the digital and the public space, and what kind of affordances we can create in the architectural forms in order to encourage certain types of social behavior. So without further ado, here's Lara and Fredrik. I just want to mention that in general, if you have any questions, there'll be questions at the end of their talk. So if you have anything really, really urgent that you need to ask, you can look at your React button. And if you press that, you can actually raise your hand and they might see it. And if it's okay at that point, they might answer. But otherwise, at the end of the lecture, that would be the good time to ask questions. Okay.
Great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alison, and thank you for inviting us. It's really great to be back here in this space that we designed in 2020, and great to see you all here, these beautiful avatars designed specifically for this event. Really an amazing view from up here. If you want to hear us better, I would suggest coming closer.
But I think now that they have raised they fixed the volume, I think people can hear us well, even from the back. And then maybe they see the screen better from back there.
Yeah, of course. Also the size of the screen. Yeah, that's true. Great.
Great. So the title of our talk, as Fredrik was saying, is Civic Architecture for the Immersive Internet, but we're going to start with a quick intro to our studio in general, so you get a sense for the work what we do. If we go to the next slide, here you see that we work with actually building buildings, especially focused on construction systems, so more architecture in the general sense. We also work on interiors and furniture collections. And we have as well worked with buildings at very different scales. So here you would see buildings that are at the scale of centers, of whole cities, whole neighborhoods. And a particular interest of us is as well working with graphics and textiles. We're going to cover that a little bit more later, in more detail later in the lecture. But yeah, basically decorative arts, ornamentation and graphics are a big part of our work. Perhaps an aspect that we will be focusing on more today is our work with virtual reality. We work in various ways with virtual reality. We work with headsets, as you are seeing now in that image. But we have also worked creating spaces like these, spaces that can be accessed from many different devices, and many of which are browser based, which means like they're very accessible and they can be reached from a browser.
And we'll go through a few of our projects, and most of these projects that we'll show are exhibitions that have been shown in galleries or museums around the world. And often through these, we have explored these ideas that we're interested in, and in some cases written about them. This is one of the first exhibitions we did in 2017, The Glass Chain, which is an exhibition in London, which is actually the first exhibition where we used VR headsets in a gallery setting like this, where you can see Lara reaching out and touching this large glass sculpture, which was reflecting on the work of the German expressionists about 100 years ago, and kind of revamping and looking again at the role of glass in design. And of course, the shift from glass being important in buildings, such as keeping weather out, to glass being literally the lens in which we look upon the virtual world, and that being, of course, physical, like glass, the way we understand the material, or in kind of variations, but essentially kind of transparent lenses. Essentially, we look at the virtual world through. We've also done quite a lot of other installations, such as this, the Wardian case, 2009, Palazzo Reale in Milan, together with the company Alcantara. Also here, we often explore the relationship between being physically in a room, as you could see there, a photograph of the space with this large physical sculpture, but also these VR headsets here, and kind of playing with the experience of being in the room with a physical thing, which is in many cases very sort of new and foreign, and experiencing it simultaneously in different versions virtually. Also, here we have the chance to introduce two other of our big interests that we will be covering today. One is the fact that here we can see a sort of virtual guide or virtual avatar, often with our voice and our motion capture, which guides the visitors through as they're wearing the headset, but also interest in tapestries and in textiles generally, and their capacity to contain vast amounts of information. And that's something that we've explored in many projects and exhibitions, such as this project also from 2018 called Value in the Virtual, which we will spend a little bit more time talking about today.
Mm-hmm. So Value in the Virtual is also maybe the introduction to the types of projects we do that are basically research projects that are maybe 1, 2, 3 years long, that then are presented in the form of an exhibition. Value in the Virtual was presented at the Arctes in Stockholm in 2018, and it dealt with the issue, or like the idea of what are cities going to be in the age of spatial computing. This is something that we're still researching today, and in fact, our upcoming exhibition that will be up in 3 weeks at the Maxi Museum in Rome is precisely continuing this line of research on what we could refer to as virtual urbanism. But at Arctes, it was basically the kickstarting of this research. And we worked with a technique that we have been exploring quite a bit since then, which is basically turning spaces into diagrams. So we basically turn the room into a diagram that is organized into 6 different spaces. you would see in the graphics of the carpet, the digitally printed carpet that occupied the whole room, that there is a sort of gradient of virtuality, where basically everything that came closer to the center had a higher degree of augmentation than the things that were away from it. And the research resulted in a series of propositions, a sort of manifesto, so where we proposed 10 points for virtual architecture. Back then, we still stand behind most of them, but I will take you through a couple. One of them dealing with virtual content and how it will radically alter the value of architecture. So for this point in particular was illustrated through an example, like one of the 6 spaces that we created, where they were all inspired by spaces within the city of Stockholm, and spaces that people from Stockholm, but also tourists, would likely have experienced if they were in the city. And then at the exhibition, they could encounter the versions of them that we have prepared. So this is the Gilded Hall. This is in the City Hall, and is a hall that basically, in its golden mosaic, it celebrates the achievements of a country historically, right? As you might be familiar from halls like that in different countries. What we were looking into is the fact that with augmentation, the messages contained and in a way frozen in those walls could constantly be updated, but at the same time, that also starts creating a conflict of value, perhaps, no? If we are celebrating the latest achievement and the walls, the gilded walls of this space become more ephemeral, then what is the value that being in this wall would have?
We can see here in the tapestry that we created, we can see instead of symbols of national pride such as kings and mythology, we see here elements from games such as Candy Crush, or perhaps like the logotype of Wikipedia or other game elements, etc., which was suggested that perhaps if we perceive a space like this augmented, these things could be celebrations that are um, sort of related to the current moment instead of something that happened hundreds of years ago. We can see some close-ups here where, of course, recreations of the golden mosaic was done in order to create a sort of immersive view of something that would perhaps then be very fleeting, of course.
Mm-hmm. And the other point in the propositions that we were going to bring up is this one that tells us that spatial experiences will become increasingly specific and tailored to its dwellers. So here we see some examples where we are envisioning, we are imagining that basically things that now arrive through platforms that look the same to both of us, becoming specific to our home or specific to the environment in which we are. Fredrik, sorry if you can, yeah, next slide and the following one. Where, well, in the previous one, we're seeing the home, and in this one, we are seeing a cafe where like your typical hipster cafe with the walls augmented with, back then, CryptoKitties was one of the earlier cryptocurrencies that were really hot at the time, and we thought it was very interesting.
And another example of this, we took a very famous artwork in a metro station in the metro of Stockholm, where feminist artist Siri Derkert sandblasted these beautiful artworks into concrete. And we're interested here in thinking about the value of art in the city, if the material is not so valuable, but the actual message is very valuable. So we imagine then what happens if those political messages in public artwork could change by the second and be different for different inhabitants of the city. What does public art as a political kind of message then mean? And also in this project, we realized that in order to kind of find some kind of grip on how we can perhaps value virtual architecture, we realized that we needed to have some kind of understanding of how we value physical architecture. So we created this quite simple but kind of overview or some basic ideas of how we value physical architecture, such as how big buildings are, where they are in the world, how they're used, etc. And we realized, and this kind of stands true still, that it's only really the last ones here on the list, um, that also apply to virtual architecture, which means that obviously it's incredibly different. There's some similarities, some things that it has in common, but it mainly things like meaning, aesthetics, and of course labor related to how much it takes to create it, etc. This exhibition was also the first one where we included a social VR, or you would now call it a metaverse integration, where if you put on the headset, yeah, we'll carry on and show some projects that kind of connects a bit more with some of the research that we've been doing in the last couple of years. I wanted to first show this project called Ven Room, which looks specifically at virtual togetherness in the home in the age of spatial computing. So basically, what happens already now when people are starting to use VR in their home, but mainly what will happen in the next 20 to 30 years as, let's say, all the members of a family are all seeing their own home through the filter of augmentation. So
Yeah, so in a way, we that first we in the previous project we were looking at the augmented city. Here we're looking in a sense at the virtual city or virtual communities that are formed purely online.
so we created a series of kind of views and also an immersive film where we're imagining all these strange kind of clashes and hybrid spaces that we would eventually really start to have to get used to as my home and your home starts to overlap and clash with one another. And this diagram here kind of explains really what we think a Venn room might be, a term that we coined in 2019 in relationship to this project. Just like you're all probably familiar with how a Venn diagram works, where you have two shapes that overlap and they create a sort of new condition in that overlap. So we're imagining that if I'm in my home and you're in yours, but we spend time together virtually with our devices, that then my dining table and your dining table might overlap and create a sort of new kind of condition. And we think that this is going to create a very kind of fundamental shift in how we live our lives in our homes and create something that we could call a sort of global home, relating, of course, to the writings of the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, who spoke about the global village. And we recently in Milan, just this spring, created a new video piece, which was projected at the Meat Center in Milan, with this kind of panoramic view where we further explore this idea of the Venn room, imagining this strange life that we might live in a sort of global home where everyone's home is in one way or another connected, not just through the devices like laptops and computers that we use at home, but literally the furniture of your home as it's scanned by your devices and uploaded and shared.
Yeah. So this immersive film that was presented in a 360 room, it was the first of the kind of this kind that we worked on. It took you through 5 different scenarios of a community of avatars that basically deals with different that has different activities together that are run from their private servers. And that takes us through basically into our interest in creating social spaces in immersive media, where we actually started not just creating immersive films that look into what this life will be like, but we started to basically build these spaces such as this one, where we could come together with other people and begin to explore what it might be to be together. What are the different forms of presence? What the different forms of presence and access imply and provide?
And actually, the first project like this that we ever worked on and proposed is from 2013, called the Cloud of Resilience, and this was, let's say, before there were any metaverse spaces or social VR spaces. And this project was a kind of speculative proposal for a WebXR project, which was both a global mortality rate database and at the same time a place where you could gather to commemorate people that have passed away. This
So
is
this
also,
brings also
yeah, go ahead.
this notion. Oh, sorry, thank you. Yeah, this brings back also the notion that we talked about before of basically turning spaces into diagrams. As Fredrik was saying, it's a database. And at the same time, it was the first time where we were exploring forms of presence. So this is the first avatar that we designed, which looked like an eye. We basically we're basing everything on sort of eye contact and direction of attention in order to communicate presence and engagement. And then as you see, the space itself was basically comprised of the diagram that had all these nodes. And once you enter those nodes, then you enter a private memorial space of this person that you were visiting. We continued then to explore this method, both to basically create browser-based spaces and that are at the same time spaces of gathering and spaces of information with our research group at UCLA, where we were looking at different types of gathering spaces. These were all functioning browser-based rooms where the students and us tested different meetings that had different features enabled, features that allowed you to teleport or to grow your avatar, or exploring the different ways in which you were represented, and also exploring non-Euclidean space, as we are seeing in this last proposal here. And this research, and also research in previous years, part of this is gathered in this report that we created. You can still access it at distantcrowds.report, where we were looking at the current status of gathering spaces online, going all the way from chat rooms and shared documents, all the way to social VR spaces. And circling back to exactly where we are, this is a very meta moment. I don't think I've now need to look at the screen. I've never lectured about this space in this space. This space was part of our first architectural commission, our first virtual architectural commission, and largest at the time in the autumn of 2020. The Fundación Arquia, which is a Spanish architecture foundation, commissioned us with this project because they were having their big annual event where they deliver grants, where a whole generation of young architects come together in the way in which you will see in the next slide. So they come together like this. Of course, being present and being together in the same room is absolutely incredibly important in order to create those bonds and meet all these people.
I think Lara, either her browser crashed or something. I will carry on and she will be back in a second. So this is what the festival usually looks like. And of course, 2020, we all remember, we all know what it was like, extremely difficult to do really anything. So they commissioned us to build this space to still hold the event, but in that case, virtually. It was meant to be held in Barcelona at that time. And we were encouraged, and we also think that it's important to kind of reference things in virtual spaces to create a sense of belonging, and that it kind of becomes easier for people to feel like they know a little bit about sort of what to expect or how to behave inside of a virtual space. So we looked at the very famous Barcelona plan and created, in a sense, a kind of non-Euclidean space, we could almost call it, the sort of endless Barcelona grid, where depending on which block you enter or exit, you might have been teleported back to the beginning or to the end of these spaces. And throughout all of these different spaces, there was many different functions. Today, sadly, we can only visit this one, which is the arena that you can see here with a group of people just before one of the lectures. And but there was also other spaces. So there was here on the left-hand side, there was a gallery space where different awards and grants were exhibited. So it's a kind of exhibition space. Then also another two exhibition spaces here. And here we see some close-ups of the cinema room where there was a film projected. You could also go up to the roof and look at an exhibition of photographs.
Yeah, and what is perhaps most interesting about these spaces is that they are all designed as sort of 2.5D spaces, I would say. As we were seeing in some of the galleries, and as we see in this space, you have some interesting room to circulate within. But then when you approach the content, you can reach a position where you can see it full screen. Pretty similar to what happens when you stand in sort of in the middle of this room, right? So it's optimized also for navigation across virtual
So here we see three different versions of me, and I'm sure many of you
platforms.
who have explored virtual spaces are familiar with this strange situation that you have maybe in many different platforms, many versions of you that are all sort of locked into these like little kingdoms. Let's say we usually refer to the writings of Jaron Lanier, who said in a beautiful text called "Why is this city square a square?" that almost everyone who has a presence online has chosen to do so via a contract with a big corporation like Facebook.
Mm.
And this kind of results in of course the fact that there are many different options, but most of them are walled places. They are places that are completely sort of locked in, and of course we often choose to work with Mozilla hubs like we are in right now, because not only because it's open source, but also because it's run by the Mozilla Foundation that has a sort of report on the health of the internet, and we really feel like their beliefs connect very much with our hopes for what the immersive internet might become. And this brings us to the kind of the end of our talk. We're going to be showing a few more projects, but which revolves around the topic around mobility in the virtual environment and on the in the immersive internet, which we think is perhaps the most important, the most difficult question and design problem and an engineering problem for the next 15 to 20 years, because to cross connect like this between different platforms is today almost impossible. Of course, we have seen ideas for how to resolve this, and at the same time as making money out of this new virtual environment, such as here Decentraland, for instance, which is creating a artificial land scarcity and creating an inflated bubble-like economy, but where you can essentially move around as if it's a persistent physical space. Of course, this is not the answer to the problems of virtual mobility.
Because
The
this
problem,
is all contained within one platform, right? So it's one platform that basically is trying to create a world when there is already a whole world out there of platforms. That what need to be done is that they need to be connected to to one another. So we find some quite interesting initiatives like the Omni group that are trying to work towards a protocol for basically for protocols that can run across all sorts of immersive experiences and immersive sites, and initiatives like these, basically like running this festival on a browser-based social VR platform, are really good because they basically enable us to start thinking about how do we create an infrastructure that can work with the internet as a whole, and not just infrastructures that work within privately owned platforms. We
And
work on yes, sorry, Fredrik, go ahead.
yeah, we work under this kind of belief, essentially, that by the middle of the 21st century, so by 2050, all media will be spatial. So meaning that we will have no more or very few smartphones or laptops or even monitors, probably even TVs, but basically that all media we perceive will come from devices that we wear individually. And considering this, we believe strongly through our research that the portal will serve as an everyday means of transportation, and um, as a design object really be the way that we move through all of these different virtual environments that we will inhabit. And this is something that we've explored a lot in our work through artworks, back to the Venn room here, the sort of imagining what it's like to pass from one space to another. We've created here artworks for the magazine cover of Metropolis Metaverse issue, where we're imagining sort of what it might be like to step from one space to the other. Here, a screenshot from a film public artwork we exhibited in Seoul, South Korea. Also imagining sort of the media that we perceive on a daily basis becoming like the gates that we move through. Here, another artwork, we're imagining what it might be like to perceive a large sort of archway in a physical public space, going from a public space into a private shared one. And we'll show a little bit more of two projects here towards the end. One that we just mentioned is The Gate to Bright Lights, which is a video installation which was shown at the Doksugun Palace in Seoul, South Korea, which is a video piece shown on a large LED screen which sits in the middle of the very beautiful gate that led into the last emperor South Korea's private bedchamber. And here we see some close-ups of the screen. On the back, it had a mirror, so that when you walked through from that side, you saw yourself instead. And we created a film where we can see all of these different kind of strange portals and doorways opening and closing that are all sort of a bit of a take on the media interfaces that we have been using for the past, let's say, focusing on the past 70 years, with a specific focus on our current situation today. And this is the original state of the gate, and we think it's extremely interesting. We've done some research in looking at what has happened to the role of gates and doors over the rollout of mass media, specifically television and later on computers, and the fact that throughout the world, really, pre-mass media, doorways and gates were quite often highly decorated because they were much more definite sort of boundaries between different spaces than they are today. Today, a door doesn't really mean that much. At this point, when this palace was still inhabited, there was no way of perceiving what was on the other side of that doorway.
Yeah, and interestingly, the doorway was often decorated and ornamented to tell the ideal story of what it was behind, the ideal and highly edited story of what was locked behind it.
So essentially, really, in our time, the gates that separates or that creates destinations to the places that we revere the most are more and more digital and comes to us through media. So this brings us to the project, the Portal Galleries, which was recently exhibited in London. And we really believe that if we are going to make portals into one of the most important mobility devices of the future, then we need to learn about how we have been thinking about portals in the past. And this is incredibly rich history, of course.
Yeah.
I'm sure many of you recognize many of these examples here.
We basically need an architectural history of the portal if this is going to become the key architectural element of of the immersive internet.
So we categorized them, we studied them, we organized them, we looked at what they look like, how they work. And it's interesting to note that nearly 30% of the top selling films of all time, they contain portals. So we really wonder, why do we crave stories where characters cross over into worlds that are unreachable to us readers and viewers? And we really believe that in a way it's a sort of way for us to prepare for this future where we will be using portals in our everyday life. And many of you that use VR and other techniques like this, or you just other forms of virtual platforms, use portals every day. So we created this large archive of about 900 different portals and films, and created this graphic, which has sort of diagram, a timeline diagram, where we established 8 which was printed on a fabric-like material and installed on a large table at the Sir John Soane Museum. Here we can see some examples of what these icons look like, where each one is a separate portal from the study. Here we can see a person sitting in the museum looking at the VR film while touching the table. So it was a sort of mixed reality experience. We're kind of looping back to some of the projects that we shown earlier. We have continued exploring this. There were 2 different sites in the museum. Both of them had 2 different VR films. There was sort of Act 1 and 2, where visitors would be able to interact with the research and actually step through actual virtual portals and experience them and be amongst them. The setting for this exhibition was the Sir John Soane Museum in central London, which itself is a sort of magical place of multiple portals built by the neoclassical architect Sir John Soane. We also had the immense pleasure of working with the archive and looking back at incredible works of art from the past, let's say, 400 years, that we think in one way or another explores virtuality in a sort of pre-digital, even pre-electronic era. And in this sense, we also studied the Sir John Soane Museum through 3D scans and learned as much as we could about the role of the museum as a sort of precursor for all of these incredible virtual spaces. And it's something we spoke about earlier as well. One of our last kind of experiments, we wanted to bring, and maybe this, Lara, is where we could round off with these last 2 images of our performance.
Yeah.
Because I'm looking at the time. What do you think? Should we to have a little bit of time for discussion as well? Maybe we can end there because we are here together with you in this space, and we think it's
I am sorry. I think
it's so important to actually be together. And when we have produced projects that use social or that use VR headsets, it's an incredibly solitary experience. So we took the opportunity when we were invited by the V&A Museum in London to perform this VR film physically with a big audience. About 900 people saw this over the different performances we had during that one night, where both me and Lara were operating these sort of virtual cameras using trackers, and taking the audience through this research and this story live in the space. And we do have a few more things to go through, but I think it would be nicer actually now. We've shown you guys so much. I hope all this makes sense. Hope it was interesting, and we can open up the floor for discussion for the remaining time we have left. Thank you all so much.
Yay, thank you. I'm sorry, my microphone kept on messing up. Sorry, I'm back now.
And I'm also I'm just gonna reload and come back in because
Yeah,
my browser has blacked out, so I can't actually see you. I'll be back in 1 minute.
Yeah, cool. But I'm here now. I don't know, Firefox kept crashing. But yeah, please come ahead with any questions. I think Fredrik just closed in the performance. Basically, the last bit that we didn't manage to have time to show was going into our more recent research which is on basically creating a textile portal infrastructure. And this research will be on show at the Maxi Museum in 3 weeks, and for about until January 2023 sometime.
Oh, sehr interessant auf jeden Fall.
Okay.
Thank you. So does anyone have questions? Now's a really good time.
Buna is
I have one.
waving. Buna
Yeah,
Dios.
I cannot find the hand. Thanks for the presentation. It's definitely inspiring to see how architecture can definitely be introduced in the digital media or even necessary.
Wonderful.
I was wondering if there would be a space for, let's call it vernacular architecture too in the digital metaverses. And what do you think about it?
I mean, in which regard are we talking about that vernacular architecture being the architecture of a place? Do you mean basically bringing in vernacular architecture from physical spaces into virtual space, or a vernacular architecture of virtual space developing?
Like it would be more that like because thinking of a stair, a stair, we all know stairs and know how to use a stair.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you put like a very abstract, yeah, but maybe vernacular is not the correct word, but if you put a very abstract forms
Yeah, the use of
and create
architecture as
space with it,
semiotics, no? Yeah.
yeah, for example.
Yeah, I think that
Um,
is, thank you for asking this. That's a very important part of our work and of our thinking. It is very common in architectural circles that you get challenged if you do things that resemble known architectural elements or that resemble known spaces. Often people will tell you, but why? It could be upside down, there is no gravity, you might create something completely new. We think, first of all, it's quite interesting to talk about creation and design like that, because there can never really be anything completely new, right? We are always combining maybe two things that have never been put together and putting them together for the first time, but you're always working with known things. And then we also feel like it's extremely important to make use of known codes, known architectural elements that can be understood as affordances, just in the same way as this room is shaped a little bit like an auditorium. No, that implies that, well, if you come really close to us, you're making a sort of commitment, or if you are facing us, we are reading that as you bringing in your attention. That is enabled by your presence of an avatar, but also by you identifying which type of room and which type of space you are in. So we actually do think that it's very important to make use of existing references very consciously and carefully for the purpose of creating a sense of familiarity. And we will eventually break all those codes. We will completely create new spaces. But we feel it's important to start from a known ground, because we're going to start from a known ground no matter what. So we might as well do that very consciously and very intentionally.
I think it's also important because you said space of semiotics, important to kind of realize how do we also navigate in our daily life, like,
Exactly. Yeah. Yes.
yeah,
Like
to
you're
translate this into
using
different.
everything is language, no? When you're creating a virtual space. So
Exactly. So at the end of the
yeah.
at the end of the day, the colors in the space and the way you also interact.
Yes.
Can
What's so interesting about that is that when you look at architectural history and the use of references, well, a lot of it, or like the time when it was at its peak, was during postmodernism, and well, there is endless theory on that and what that has resulted on. And even now, currently, we see the use of, for example, neoclassical architecture to that has political implications and ideological implications and so on. So it's complex. It's a complex ground, but I think it's incredibly interesting and almost unavoidable everything is going to be read in one way or another, right? So we might as well just try to really do it intentionally. Yeah.
Yeah, it's similar to the language that's already built up around the use of the internet, like tabs
Yeah. Yes.
and we have certain hyperlinks. We have certain basic language around things like that. I guess are equivalent to what you're mentioning, like a staircase or a door handle, and we can already kind of
Yeah.
not really change them, or there's certain things that has to be fundamentally there so that we can actually use it, just like
Mm.
crossings in the city, etc. So I mean, it's
Yeah.
extremely interesting and fun, we think, to be part of this era now when we're building up this new vocabulary. But probably more than ever before, we need to actually mirror the physical world, and we think it's not something negative.
No, I think in a way, by mirroring it, we really get to understand what it means. Like sometimes when you build a virtual chair or a virtual staircase, you get to understand what an actual staircase means beside what it does. Because in virtual space, it most of the time it doesn't do anything functionally, but it's doing a lot semiotically.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's a super
And
great
in the
question.
future, do you think in the future this will shift? Like, do you think yeah, I don't know, we will develop different ways of
Yeah,
communicating through spaces?
Language is incredibly organic, no? Even our spoken language
Yeah.
keeps shifting, and the connotations that it have keep changing, and so definitely will change. I think something that Fredrik was saying is very interesting. That I think we will soon start to see more and more integration or readings of the semiotics that we find already in computer interfaces, in 2D computer interfaces, and to see how that is adapted into spatial computing interfaces. That is going to be even devices, no? I think
True.
as soon as we start seeing a more widespread spatial computing, we are very likely going to be holding iPads, holding phones inside our immersive media goggles. And I think we shouldn't look at that with in a condescending way, but we should actually look at that in a critical way to really see like, well, why are we doing this? Is this really good? I think also like in terms of presence, no, the fact that I can be represented by a cursor in a document, that might have positive aspects as well. So I think we need to embrace. I think what is going to change is that I think or like ways in which it's going to evolve is that I think we're going to see the integration of also references that not only come from the built environment, but also references that come from the 2D interface realm. And I think that will be really exciting. And then I guess a language of its own will begin to form, and who knows what that will be or what that will look like. We will all build that together as we go along.
Thanks. Thank you. Very interesting.
thank you.
Cool. So
Any more questions? Anything else you'd like to ask or talk about?
I might have another one.
Sure.
um, like after watching the presentation, I was also wondering, like, if you can. I know you work with hubs now, and we are in hubs. But what other elements and digital tools do you use for like your workflow,
technically, yeah. Well,
technically speaking?
we work with different workflows depending on what it is. So for browser-based experiences, is very much Blender to and then exporting it to this. We have very interestingly worked with coders who have created features, code on top of the Mozilla Hubs stack, where we have also worked with that together with students, and that has been incredibly interesting to see that like these browser-based spaces are so much like a website that you can start building on top of them with quite a lot of flexibility. So that made us really excited about this format, even if we all know it's glitchy and it's still very early days. And then for our immersive films, we generally work with game engines and mainly Unreal Engine and different modeling software that we used for that. As well as very old, we started with very old school means like sketches and very simple things. And yeah,
Yeah.
lately we've also been
Right.
exploring quite a bit 360 spaces. So we have also been looking at non-social immersive spaces that are based on the browser, where you can explore, where you can go through a 360, a series of 360 environments. And yeah, we have lately been looking a lot into that as like these 360 rooms or 360 websites becoming the lobby space for other immersive platforms.
Yeah. Yeah. And then in terms of platforms also, we are transitioning to start to build for VR chat, which is it's the
Yeah.
platform that we have actually spent the most time in. Like that's like most people who actually spend time in virtual spaces using VR end up being there because it's the most thriving community, even though it has its problems. So that's the sort of space we are exploring now. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, looking forward to future projects.
Great,
Thanks.
thank you.
Wonderful. Nice. Well, so Alison, I don't know if we can still hear
Yeah.
you.
No, I'm here. I was just waiting to hear. But I thank you so much. This has been super insightful, and your work is absolutely gorgeous as well. And it's so for me, it's also really special to hear and hear you talk about your work in a work that you've made, where
Yeah.
like you can even see like the textures and details of like the digital, like with this kind of grid that we always recognize on like on Photoshop and things like this, combining with the space and even the color palettes of how you go about the softness that you achieve. So it's quite lovely to see you present this work in this space. I feel like it's an added layer to understanding kind of what kinds of atmospheres and also like the kind of feeling that you have. Like when I'm in this space, actually, I perceive that it's quite open. It's it's academic to some extent, but it's also very friendly and engaging. So how you've designed that even for your talk is quite funny to be in the space and have that. Um, so I just want to thank you both so much. It's been super insightful for everyone here.